Hello, I'm Matt Box and I'm a full-time brand strategist and part-time stand-up comedian, and I'm here to teach you all about how the world of stand-up can help you sell. So this week is all about owning the prejudice. So that is about taking any kind of negative existing preconceptions about your brand, about you, and using those for your advantage. Essentially, this is the monetisation of self-deprecation. So if you watch any stand-up comedian, they'll start their set with what's called an opener, which is the first joke, the purpose of which is to demonstrate competence, so to tell people that you're going to make them laugh, but also just to break tension. If anyone has any preconceptions about you, if anyone's thinking, who's this hipster, ginger Jesus, untanned orangutan, I can break that tension with a joke at the beginning. So a joke I quite often use, this is a bit of a stigma about having red hair in the UK, is that I'll go on stage, I'll say, "Right, I noticed I'm a ginger man. Good insight into growing up ginger. You get bullied for the colour of pubes, you haven't grown yet." Now a much better example is Joe Brand. Just think about very sexist clubs in the 1980s. Joe Brand comes onto the stage, moves the mic stand, says, "I'll move that so you can see me." A better fat joke than any heckler was going to make. Just in the very deadpan delivery style that Joe Brand has, it works really well. So we've got Joe Brand, who's very good at taking that prejudice about being a larger lady and using it for her own advantage. And the same is true for other brands. So an example I really like is the 2014 Super Bowl commercial for Radio Shack. So the perception of the brand at the time was that they were stuck in the past, that it was something for old people, that it was maybe a blockbuster compared to a modern Netflix. So what they did is they owned that prejudice. They made an advert all about the 80s characters, all of your favourites, completely revamping the store. The line was, the 80s called, they want their store back. So they took a negative joke about the brand and they turned it into a positive. And what was amazing is that after years and years of decline, they suddenly saw an uplift in the share price of Radio Shack. All from being funny, from taking a prejudice and owning it. And there are tons of examples like this. There's a book by a guy called Nairn, who's a bit of a legend in the UK advertising scene, who's written a book called Go Luck Yourself. In that, he talks about working with a guy called Lloyd Grossman. Now, Lloyd Grossman was a very famous TV presenter when he originally released a range of pasta sauces. But around 2009, his star had faded a little bit and he focused on things that weren't TV. But something very memorable about Lloyd Grossman is the way he talks. He's got a very half kind of British, half Bostonian accent that's very, very distinctive. But obviously that's a really awkward thing to try and mention to your client, that they talk like a weirdo. Cut to a rather awkward meeting with Lloyd and his brand team. We pored over their data, reviewed the competition in excruciating detail. We looked at the new products that were coming through. In short, we talked about everything apart from the one thing we needed to. Poor man must have thought we were behaving very oddly. Eventually, I'd had enough and bravely took things into my own hands, by which I mean I passed a note to my partner Helen and asked her to do something. And guess what? When she gingerly mentioned the fact that the one thing people associated with Lloyd was his voice, he laughed out loud. It turned out that this was not news to him at all, because even my children make fun of me all the time. That's what his voice sounds like. That's a very accurate impression, I think you'll find. This was the breakthrough we needed. Instead of shying away from the supposed problem, we embraced it. We stuck with the name but developed a line to breathe new life into it, sauces with a distinctive voice. So that's a great example of taking something distinctive, memorable, different about you as a person and being able to sell it. So that's exactly the same kind of thing a stand-up comedian would do. They'd acknowledge that they have a strange voice and they'd make something of it. They'd own that, they'd make that into a positive, into an asset. So other great examples of this include Domino's Pizza Turnaround. They made big billboard advertising explaining that people thought their crust tasted like cardboard. Turn that as an opportunity to say, we looked at our recipe, we've improved it. Another great example, KFC in the UK had a real issue with the perception of their fries, so they promoted negative tweets about their fries for weeks and weeks and weeks. Everyone's like, why is KFC promoting something that says their chips are awful? Well, it's because they were changing the recipe, so they wanted to kind of promote that people thought they were bad, so they can then let everyone know we've improved that recipe. Exactly the same, using a negative perception of the brand and using it as a way to boost reappraisal. So, why does this work? Well, there is some research around something called the pratfall effect that could have the answer. It's a really good book by a guy called Richard Shotton, The Choice Factory, all about behavioural biases. The pratfall effect. So in 1966, Harvard University psychologist Elliot Aronson, along with colleagues Ben Williman and Joanne Floyd, recorded an actor answering a series of quiz questions. So they've got different versions of this actor, and some of them he's getting lots of the answers wrong, and some of them he's getting lots of answers right. But there's two different versions of him getting lots of answers right, so he's demonstrating competence. There's one where he knocks a cup over, so he kind of has an accident. He demonstrates a mistake. In that, the research showed that he was much more approachable and likeable than the person who just got, a smart ass that got all the answers right and didn't spill a cup. And so what that demonstrates is that when people make mistakes, they're much more likeable. So if you demonstrate that you accept a flaw, then your brand becomes much more likeable. People are much more likely to buy from you. Now, there's more research that's gone into this. So there's a guy called Adam Ferrier, and Richard Shotton also replicated this study, but he showed images of cookies. So one of them is perfectly round versus one that has kind of a rough edge with maybe a few crumbs around. And the ones with the rough edge or the crumbs, the slight kind of imperfections, are much more successful in their advertising. To show some little imperfection makes it a bit more authentic, makes it a bit more appealing. And you can do this yourself in meetings as well. A guy that I used to work with, a very, very talented man called Jez Groom, at the start of meetings or talks, he would demonstrate his competence and then have a joke about his height. So he'd say, I've been in the business 20 years. I sold a business that I created from the ground up. I'm the founder of this behavioural science unit, but I struggle to get on the rides at Legoland. Now, that isn't a direct quote. I've made up a height joke for illustrative purposes. But the key is that he understood from his kind of behavioural research background that made him more likeable. So think about the way you introduce yourself to colleagues, the way you start talks. I'd make a list of all the things, the negative stereotypes around the category, around the products you have, around maybe you, yourself, and then think of ways that you can counteract those, make a joke out of them, make them funny, make them interesting, and make them ownable. That way you can own the prejudice, embrace the pratfall effect, and ultimately be more likeable, approachable, and sell more. Right, I think that's enough from me. If you've got any good examples of a comedian or a brand that owns the prejudice, feel free to drop those in the comments and let me know. If you like it, feel free to like and subscribe, share it with a friend. If you hate it, take that to the grave. Bye!